But anyway, we're all good today, I think. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so I am recording. Today's lecture, Access and Security. What we'll cover today, we're going to talk about introduction to security, topics like passwords, authentication, and encryption. On Wednesday, we'll talk about different attack types and, like I said, a little bit of this notable attacks and vulnerabilities on Facebook, just to give some concreteness to some of the security threats we're talking about. And then last, some attributes of attackers and defenders, like who attackers are, why they do it, and how they can be stopped to some extent, or at least, make their job harder. Okay, so security and access are basically two sides of the same coin. Access means making sure that the people who are supposed to be able to look at data are able to look at it. Security, on the other hand, pretty much means that people who aren't supposed to be able to do something do it. Okay, so you need both of those. You need both a mechanism to keep the bad guys out and a mechanism to let the good guys in. All right, so that's pretty much it. And both of them, the standard model is permission based, right? Somebody presents their access credentials, and the system looks them up in some database and says, oh, here you are, I find an entry for you, and let's see if your credentials that you're showing me, like your password, match what we expect to see that's stored in the database. And if it does, boom, you get in with whatever level of permission you have in the database. All right. Now, basic categories of security threats: physical, personnel, and software. Okay, now this is an IDS class, so of course we're going to focus mostly on software, but recognize that security is bigger than just making sure you have antivirus software installed. For example, just lately at UIC, there was a couple years ago, some dude lifted a bunch of data from a database and was trying to do a bunch of identity theft operations. And he was applying for unemployment benefits in the name of, a lot of people. And I was one of them. So when I got this, unemployment thing in the mail, and I got this, little debit card that I was supposed to create an account and join, I was like, what the hell is this? As far as I know, I still have my job. But yeah, so that's kind of a personnel issue, right? That the person who's supposed to be watching this stuff, somehow they go in there and get some stuff they're not supposed to do. You could also have a physical attack, right? So for example, if the data is stored on a machine that's in a room that's obviously not closely guarded at night, there could be some bad guy could come in, break down the door, and pull one of the hard drives off a machine that has some sensitive data on it, right? And then it's pretty easy to bypass whatever access credentials are there unless the data is actually encrypted. And of course, the one we usually talk about is software, right? We're all familiar with the dangers of going to sketchy web pages and having them try to install malware on your machine. And you probably all have either at least the default Microsoft antivirus, or something like Norton, or maybe Malwarebytes, which is pretty good. Yeah, so a bunch of different ones out there. Now, of course, any of those aspects can be the point of vulnerability for a major security breach. And some of the really big ones, they tend to span multiple. So for example, Target had a huge security breach about 10 years ago, late 2013. And it's the reason why on any credit card these days, like my Target card here, you'll have a little chip there. And the chip means that you have to have the card physically present in your hand, and it has to be legit. And this chip does a randomized code that can't be duplicated by somebody who just knows your credit card number. Anyway, what happened in that breach, the bad guys sent an email to one of Target's heating, ventilation, air conditioning vendors, had a bad attachment. Dude opened up the attachment when they shouldn't have, which gave the bad guys some access credentials to get to the login portal. At the login portal, they were able to bypass some stuff, enter in admin credentials instead. They got to the servers. The servers pretty much all had default passwords like admin and password on them, so they were able to crack right through them. The only good thing was that the big database of all the account information was encrypted, so they couldn't do much with that. But what they were able to do was piggyback a software update process on all the point of sale machines that Target had. So every time somebody scanned their card at Target at a checkout, it saved that data, that card data, the account number, the expiration date, the CVV code, and bundled it up and sent it to the bad guys. So again, things like this. Personnel, dude's not supposed to open an attachment from an unexpected source, right? Maybe his antivirus was down too. Software, Target, they failed in all sorts of basic security things too. And of course, the software, there had to have been some vulnerabilities in there for the guys to do what they were doing. So, all right. Now, so we'll start from the perspective that perfect security is impossible. You cannot have perfect security. Reason is, if you have a system and you want people to use it, there has to be some mechanism for people to get into the system, right? There have to be some keys. Well, if keys exist, they could be guessed. Somebody could say, I'm going to guess what that key is look like, right? I'm going to guess somebody's password. You could make a copy of them. This was a fairly standard thing. And when they first did those remote car openers, they would just send out a little pulse of information to the car, and the lock would recognize, like, oh, this is that one. Sure. So I'm going to unlock the doors. But guess what? So the bad guy, or, remote starters too. So the bad guy said, oh, if it's that simple and stupid, we'll just stand in a parking lot with a recording device and capture all of those pulses. And after a while, they had a huge database of pulses. They could kind of go to any parking lot if they wanted to lift a car and lift one, right? Because that's all it did. They echoed out the sound they heard, copy of the keys. Or people can steal them, right? They can hack your account. If you have a document in your cubicle that says, oh, here's my passwords, somebody can come by and swipe that, or they can co-opt them. They can make them work in some way that wasn't intended. So again, key takeaway, perfect security is impossible. And the reason is people need some means of access to get into the system, but it's possible that means of access could be used in a way that, was not intended. All right, so entertaining story if you want to read it at some point. This is about some Canadian bank robbers. So there was a bank on the ground floor of like a 3-floor building. And the bad guys, the bank's pretty well guarded, but here's the trick we're going to do. We're going to wait until a 3-day weekend in Canada. The top 2 levels are abandoned for what, not abandoned, but, they're not in use. They're not, rented out at the time. So they set up a tent over the top of the building like they were doing some kind of maintenance, right? And the 3-day weekend, nobody's coming to the bank because, right, nobody's there. So what the bad guys do, they pretend they're making a lot of noise, doing maintenance up there, but what they're actually doing is drilling through the roof and then drilling through the floor and then drilling through the floor again, which is actually the bank ceiling. Well, they had a map of how the bank was laid out, so they're able to drop right into the big vault with all the safety deposit boxes and spend like 2.5 days picking over stuff and saying, oh, this looks nice. This looks nice too. This looks nice. This looks nice too. Okay, so again, the banks spend all this money on a big vault door made out of like battleship armor or something, but the dudes just cut in through the ceiling. So yeah, they didn't get away with it. One of their guys squealed to the cops, and they all went to prison for a long, long time. So don't rob banks. It's morally suspect. Probably wrong. I mean, depends on the bank, I guess, but yeah. Okay. Now, security and access are both going to be provided by some kind of application-specific set of permission rules, right? Typical thing, there's a user interface, asks for your ID and password, you put them in, hit enter, and the database checks, does the stuff you entered match what we have stored in our database? There's also backup options like security questions, things like what's your dog's middle name, or what street did you live on when you were 4, stuff like that. And then in the back end, there's a permission-based filtering about what portions of the system you have to access. So for example, I log into Blackboard. I don't get access to everything in Blackboard. I just have access to my courses. And other things too, my teaching assistants, for example, I can boot them from a course, but they can't boot me from a course because, instructor outranks teaching assistant. So I have that permission that they don't. Anyway, standard thing, if the access conditions are met, if your credentials look good, then the user gets access appropriate to their permission level in the system. Now, for Facebook has a lot of finely grained privacy options, right? So first of all, the default setting, of course, friends can see what you post, non-friends can't, although you can even override that. But within friends, you can, of course, designate special subset of friends, right? Like family, close friends, acquaintances, whatever, and give them specific access to things you're doing, right? Because, for example, if you go out to some wild party and there's a bunch of awesome pictures you'd like to share with your friends, but maybe you don't want grandma to see, yeah, stuff like that. And of course, with applications too, there's all sorts of applications on Facebook that ask permission to see some of your activity data. For example, the end of the year, one of the things you can do is create like a word picture of all the words you've included in Facebook posts throughout the year. And if you say that, well, obviously that application needs to be able to scan, your year's worth of history in order to see that. All right, so the way it works as far as delivering data to people, all content on Facebook has a permission type in its metadata, basically who can see it. So something like friends of Doug, family of Doug, acquaintances of Doug, whatever. Anytime there's private content, something that you don't have permission to see, it's not going to be served. So if somebody goes to my page and I have a bunch of stuff on there that's only for close friends, but I've labeled them as an acquaintance, they're not going to be able to see all that stuff, right? It's just when Facebook's trying to construct that web page of the feed, that stuff is simply going to be skipped over in the construction process. Okay. Now, primary access method for the vast majority of websites and other systems around the world is a combination of email and password, or some kind of user ID and password. So for passwords, typically there's going to be some kind of length requirement, right? It has to be a certain number of letters long, because if you had a single character password, it would be pretty easy to guess, right? Yeah, it wouldn't do much good. Likewise, character mix requirement, right? Your password may say has to have at least one lowercase letter, one uppercase letter, one number, one special character, right? Things like that to make sure that there are more options at each character and make the password harder to guess. It may even require periodic updates, like once a year at UIC, for example. And you can have backup mechanisms, again, like security questions or a primary phone number that they can send you an email to get through to you if, for example, you completely forget your password. All right. Now, a weak password, we're going to distinguish between weak and strong passwords. So a weak password is one that's relatively easy to guess by someone other than the account owner. So, for example, a short password just containing letters would be a lot easier to guess than a long password with many possible non-letter options. A password that includes complete words is also really weak. Imagine, for example, people are just using single words for their password. That makes the account vulnerable to what's called a dictionary attack, where the bad guys simply take a dictionary and look at all the common words in there and try them out as passwords on every account that they have credentials for. And if Facebook lets you do that, a lot of people would just use complete words, like parrot or spaghetti, and hopefully they spell spaghetti right. I don't know. But the bad guys would catch a bunch of people doing this. And in fact, this was a common sort of attack that people would often get away with when the password creation process wasn't that rigorous, wasn't that strict. Other things like simple sequences, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, right? Those are sequences that are pretty easy to guess. And a lot of systems will prevent you from doing that, right? Like you can't do a quadruple digit as your PIN code or something like 1, 2, 3, 4 for most applications, because they know if you let people do something like 1, 2, 3, 4, there's going to be a lot of people dumb enough to do it at this point. Other risk factors, anything derived from personal information, right? So this is the sort of thing you see a lot on cop shows, right? It's like there'll be some big drug kingpin with like some oceanfront mansion, and the cops go in there, and he's got like a desktop in the corner, right? And most of the time, it's not even password protected, right? They just like turn it on and boop, everything's right there. I'm saying if I were like $1 billion drug guy, I would at least password protect my computer. Just saying. But the other thing, even if it is password protected, they're going to have like the smart guy on the team. He's going to be like, well, I know his wife's name is Sharon, and she was born in 1972, and they have 3 kids and a dog, so the password has to be ABQR1257. And they go, and it, right? It's always shit like that. So anyway, but in real life, yeah, stuff derived from personal information, things like birthdays, years, those are pretty likely guesses too, right? If you did a big scan of all the PIN codes out there and you just went with, days of the year, you'd probably catch a whole lot of them. Last factor, second factor, used on other sites, right? So if you have one password on an important site and you use that password on a bunch of other sites, it starts to get pretty likely that at least one of those sites has weak security, and then the bad guys can come back and try to get, into the popular site with it. So for me, for a long time, I still have a Yahoo account, but the password for my Yahoo account, once I started around the time I stopped using it there, I was using it as a junk password on, sites that I didn't really care. They required to create an account and have a login process, but it wasn't anything on there that I was worried about getting hacked, so I didn't care. But the interesting thing, a few years later, when I'm trying to demo something in my web analytics class about spam email, and I look in there and it says, "We have your password, blah, blah, blah." And I was like, holy shit, that is my password. Well, I got to take a look at this. And, it's the usual scam thing. They said, "We know who you are. We have access to your account history. And we know you've been doing a lot of shady shit online. And if you don't send us 10 grand in Bitcoin, we're going to call your grandma and the cops." And I was like, I don't recall doing anything that, would be likely to get me in legal trouble or even grandma trouble. So I was like, yeah, this is go change my my Yahoo password. So I wasn't even worried about that. But the point is, these things do eventually get hacked. So don't use one password on a bunch of different sites. Last, infrequently or never change. So a lot of times what happens with passwords is people who hack them, they're not really after you in particular. They're trying to get a large pool of access credentials, and they're trying to sell them off to somebody else who wants to use them for whatever purpose. So what happens is, they hack the accounts, they bundle up all the passwords together, they try to sell them on the dark web, and maybe it takes like a month or two to get it done. But between the time it takes to gather the data and the time it takes to actually sell it and the time it takes for those guys to actually act on it, if you've changed your password, in the last few months, there's a pretty good chance that they're not actually going to even get your stuff. But if you never change your password, if you use the same one for like 20 years, then again, you have a much higher chance of falling victim to something like that. Okay, so strong passwords. The ideal for a strong password is a long randomized string of numbers, upper and lowercase letters, punctuation, symbols, right? A wide mix of character types. Something that's unrelated to prior passwords. So it's not like you could just guess what the next password be. If your password is 123 and then you change it to password 124, something that's specific to Facebook, right? Used only on Facebook, not on other sites. So the advantage of a strong password, it's pretty much impossible to guess it in time for it to be useful, right? Or before the account gets locked. A lot of times with these kind of things, you can look at it and do some math and figure out that basically every computer in the world would have to be cooperating to try to hack, to log into your account with every possible option. And even then, it would take them centuries to do it. But the disadvantage of this kind of password, it is very difficult to remember unless you're robot-like. And most people aren't robot-like. Right? I mean, I have a few oddball passwords that I keep here and just up here because they're important, but the vast majority of my passwords, they're out somewhere else or they're stored on my application, whatever. All right. Now, you don't have to do math in this class. I'm not going to make you guess, calculate the probability of guessing a password, but just the formula for it is n to the negative c, which is what it's saying. The probability of guessing it is 1 in, n to the c. So if you have n options per character and so many characters, it's n times n times n times n times however many characters you have, right, is the number of possibilities that there could be for your password. So the chance of guessing it is 1 in that, which means if your password is longer, it becomes exponentially harder to guess it. If your password contains a wider character mix, again, it becomes exponentially harder to guess it. And just like that bank vault, if your password is hard to guess, the bad guys aren't going to waste their time guessing it, right? They're not going to try to drill through that vault door. They're going to try to come up with some other way to get to what they want to get to. Now, one of those, suppose they do have it. Suppose they got some malware and they lifted your password and your ID, and in theory, they could get in. Well, multi-factor authentication is designed to block that. So the idea for that is you have some backup like your phone that if somebody wants to log into your account from an unexpected device, it sends a message to your phone and gives you a code and you can log in with that code. There are other options, of course. We'll talk about those in a moment. But one place where this is used besides Facebook is, of course, Fortnite, right? Because there's content in the game that you can buy. And it's played by a lot of kids who are probably foolish enough to share their account name and password with people. Oh, yeah, you're my buddy. Sure, I'll tell you my password. I trust you so much. Right? I mean, kids give that stuff up sometimes. So what you do is the parent will have, an email account associated with the game. And if somebody says, oh, you gave me your ID and password, well, guess what? They try to log in from a new machine. The parent's going to get an email that says, someone has tried to log into your machine from a new thing. Here's the code. If it was you, use this code, but the bad guys won't see it. All right. Likewise for UIC, actually, if you want to look at your payroll information, if you're employed here, there's multi-factor authentication. But one of the factors can be just being logged into the UIC network, right? So if I'm sitting in my office using UIC Wi-Fi and I try to look at my payroll stuff, find out how much I'm getting paid in a couple weeks, they're going to say, yeah, okay, fine. You logged in with your, account ID and password. You're using UIC's network. Those are two factors. If I try to do that at home, they say, nope, we got to send you a code and you got to type in that code. So like I said, it can play out in different ways. Anyway, the usefulness of multi-factor authentication is for when some random person tries to log into your account and they have your username and password, right? Where it's not going to work is if your username and password is stored locally on your device, right? Like somebody lifts your phone and you don't have it with any kind of lock screen, and they just get in there and they say, oh, I'll try this banking app and see what I can do with that, right? They do that kind of thing. Then yeah, they're going to obviously be able to bypass the two-factor authentication because the text that they get is going to come right to that machine, even if it goes there, right? It might be, well, I'm using the regular machine, so they're not going to know, the machine's not going to know the difference. Anyway, also a link here, multi-factor authentication. So this one, you guys may have a memory of the DNC, Democratic National Committee, getting hacked during the 2016 election, rather. Anyway, what happened with that, it's kind of a funny story. So there was an intern there whose one of his jobs is to read email for, the chair of the committee. And so it's Sunday morning, and there was probably a big party the night before, and everybody was out too late and got too drunk. And the dude rolls in the morning and starts scanning through this massive long list of email. And one of the emails that's actually an attempt to steal somebody's password that says, oh, your password needs to be updated. Please log into our secure server with your current credentials to get your new password. And the intern makes a mistake, clicks the wrong box that says, definitely respond to this rather than ignore. And, the guy at the top who, is probably some old dude who barely knows how email works. That's kind of a joke. He wasn't that old, and I'm sure he knows how email works. He's scanning through it all, and he sees, oh, okay, my intern vetted this. It must be good. I'm going to respond to this. So that's how they got him, is basically they got somebody at a careless moment and then tricked the real account owner to giving the keys away. All right. So next thing to talk about is encryption. So we'll talk about encryption, and we will also talk about hashing in a moment. So if you have a database for user account credentials, you don't want to just store passwords as plain text. Reason is, if some hacker gets access to that database, they'll be able to see the entire list of usernames and passwords, and it will be an absolute nightmare, okay? Especially if you don't detect right away that they did get that breach. So hackers could download it all, and sell it, whatever. But if that data is encrypted, then the hackers only get the masked data, right? The scrambled data. And in fact, something like this happened with eBay several years ago, where, their database of usernames and passwords, it was all scrambled, it was encrypted, but the bad guys hacked in and they got basically that entire database, right? A brick of 100 gigs of account information. And last I heard, they were trying to sell it on the dark web for $50, but hadn't found any takers because nobody's that interested in a big brick of encrypted data that you can't do anything with. So anyway, encryption algorithms basically take ordinary plain text and scramble it to some sort of gibberish using a fixed pattern. And the key point of encryption is that it is reversible, right? If something is encrypted, you want to be able to look at the data in its correct form at some point, right? So you have to be able to undo the process. There is a related process called hashing. In hashing, yeah, you can still scramble the data, But instead of there being a one-to-one correspondence where anything you encrypt can be decrypted to its original form, hashing takes a potentially unbounded set of inputs and reduces them to a very limited set of options, right? So you might say all of the different possible passwords you can come up with, that would be untold, trillions and more of different passwords. We're going to boil all them down to like 100 billion or 2 billion possibilities, right? So there'd be like a 1 in 2 billion chance that somebody could guess a password and get in that way. But the point is, since it boils down to like 2 billion possibilities, it's not going to be reversible because each one of those possibilities could could correspond to many millions of possible options. Okay, so encryption is reversible, hashing is not, and on we go. Okay, next thing. Suppose we have two people named Yvonne and Zoe, and they want to communicate through email, but they have to send all of their messages over an open network. So how can they encrypt their messages without fear of decryption by any intermediaries or listeners? Because remember, Yvonne and Zoe, they're only communicating by email, right? So if they're going to have some shared scheme of like how the encryption is going to happen, they would have to send that over the email as well. All right. So if Yvonne and Zoe already have an encryption scheme, then that's going to be fine. They can scramble it because they'll both keep the scheme private. Nobody else can use it, right? Like submarines do. Every submarine has a code book. If they want to send out a message, they consult the code book, and all the submarines, are basically have access to that as long as they're on the same side. So if they have a common encryption scheme, then encryption is easy and safe, and they don't have to worry about it. But suppose we're talking something like websites, where you have a website with potentially billions of users, and every user going to hundreds or even thousands of websites, right? So you don't want to share the same encryption scheme with every other user of a website, because some of those users are probably going to be happy to steal your information. Same thing for websites, right? You don't want to just use one encryption scheme on every website, because some of those websites are probably pretty sketchy. So and establishing a unique coding scheme, a unique encryption scheme for every pair of users is going to really slow things down. Imagine if every time you went to a website, you had to wait for them to come up with some encryption scheme and somehow transmit that information to you outside of it. It's like, you wanted to go shop at a website, but they said, oh, sorry, well, we can't really send you this data securely. So if you want to get it, you're going to have to, show up in person at our company door, and then we'll hand you the book. And it'd be crazy. You can't do that. So, question, how can Yvonne and Zoe exchange their keys without a listener also obtaining them? Well, we have a magical thing called two-key encryption. And the core idea of two-key encryption is that Yvonne and Zoe each have two keys to lock and unlock messages. By lock, I mean encrypt, and unlock, of course, decrypt. So the logic behind this is that there are some mathematical operations that are really easy to do one way, but very difficult to undo. For example, if you take two very large prime numbers, and when I say very large, I mean, like dozens of digits long, and multiply them together, for a computer, that's pretty much instantaneous, right? It's a little tricky for humans, but for computers, boom, it's no problem. But if you have the product of the two numbers, and you tell a computer to factor it out into those two primes, that is not easy for a computer to do. That will take, again, if these are big primes, it will take all computers on Earth many centuries to solve that problem, because they have to consider every single possibility, because they're prime numbers. They have to scan through everything. So that's the essence of this, is essentially that if you want to think about what do we mean by keys we mean big numbers, big prime numbers. And if we multiply them together to do the encryption, it's really hard to break them apart into their factors unless you know what the factors are, unless you have the decryption code. Okay, that's the idea of what's going on here. Now, every user will have a unique pair of public and private keys. And it doesn't matter which number is which. You can arbitrarily pick one number to be the private key, one number to be the public key. The magic of it is they are special pairs of numbers that any number encrypted with the public key can be decrypted with the private key. And any message that's been encrypted with the private key can be decrypted with the public key. So the way this works in practice, every user shares their public key all over the world. Anybody can have it. You can put it on billboards all over town. But they keep the private key private, right? So if this is Yvonne's public key, and Yvonne hangs on to her own private key, but she gives the private key to everybody in the world, right? And if somebody wants to send a private message to Yvonne, they encrypt it with Yvonne's public key, and then she and only she can decrypt it because she and only she has the private key, has her Yvonne's private key that can decrypt it. Neat thing about this, it's a very extensible model for large groups of users, right? Basically, every user requires 2 keys. So if n is a billion, say, only 2 billion keys need to be located, constructed, calculated, whatever. Whereas if you're talking about a large pool of users, a billion users, you would need about n squared. You would need a unique key for every communication pair. So a unique pair of keys, that would be a big hassle. Anyway, so an example. So Yvonne and Zoe, they exchange public keys while keeping their private keys private, right? So I'm going to put this in Paint. Okay. So Yvonne gives Zoe her Y public key and keeps her own Y private key. Okay. Zoe gives Yvonne her Zoe public key and keeps her own Zoe private key. Okay. If Yvonne wants to send a message to Zoe, Yvonne will encrypt it with Zoe public, right? With Zoe's public key, because only Zoe's private key can decrypt it, right? Thus, the message is secure. Likewise, if Zoe wants to send a response back, Zoe will encrypt it with Yvonne's public key, because only Yvonne's private key can decrypt it. Okay? Does that make sense? Questions? Would you like to know more? All right. So the reason why this is called asymmetric encryption, right? If it's symmetric encryption, then basically the 2 sides of the communication, they're using the same set of keys, right? They both encrypt and decrypt messages with the same code. In this case, it's asymmetric, right? Yvonne's using a different scheme from Zoe. All right. Now, next thing, hashing. So Yvonne wants to send a message to Zoe, but she's worried that her brother Xerxes might tamper with it. So Xerxes is not going to be able to read the message, right? Because it's been encrypted, but he could still mess with some of the data in the message, right? In the message, he could capture it somehow, alter it a little bit, then forward it out with unpredictable results. So, question, how can Zoe verify that any received message is in fact unchanged? Well, in this case, they could do a hashing process. This is something that's often used as what's called a checksum. So all the data in that message gets run through a hash function, producing what's called a hash sum. So what that kind of hash sum is, imagine if you have a long sequence of numbers, an arbitrarily large sequence of numbers, and you add them all up. Okay, at the end, you're going to end up with some pretty big number, right? But suppose you say, well, we're only going to keep the last 8 digits of that. Okay, so you only keep the last 8 digits of that number. And if you want to see if the math was all correct, it's a pretty good check to say, well, we'll have another device add all those numbers, and we'll see if the last 8 digits or the lowest 8 digits on that sum match the other lowest 8 digits. Okay, that's the idea for a hash sum. So you take all the information of that message, convert it to numbers, add them up, and keep some lowest batch of digits. Well, the chances that Xerxes doing this with an encrypted message is able to both change the content of the message and change that hash sum so that they actually match at the end is going to be vanishingly small, right? Because you could do like 32 or 64 bits worth, and it's really, 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 really unlikely that they would ever get it. Okay, so that's another use of hashing there. All right. Now the rest of this, we just have a few slides. So, okay. So spam accounts. So Facebook knows that there are going to be a fair number of people out there that are trying to make fake accounts for malicious or devious purposes. So some reasons why people might do them. Number one, as an advertising tool. Imagine if there's an advertiser on Facebook, business on Facebook, that they have some product and they want to improve the public perception of their products. Well, they could set up, these kind of message boards and have fake accounts go there and talk about, oh, I just tried, the XYZ 123 vacuum cleaner and it was so good, it'll change your life. You get a bunch of people to post up messages like that. Could also be a contact for criminal activity, right? So on Facebook, I have all kinds of I get several of them every year. I get not as many as I used to. Phony friend requests, right? From girls who are far too young and cute to ever just send me a message from out of thin air. And I'm sure, either one, it's like a front for prostitution, or they're trying to lure me into some sort of compromising situation, something. They're trying to scam me for money. I remember once, a long time ago, when I was pretty new to Facebook. So I was in the Navy in the 90s for a while, and I've gotten friends from like people who I just had like casually met at some point. And this was somebody, she was in a military uniform. She was like Army or something. Maybe Marines, I don't remember anymore. But anyway, so she sent me a friend request, and I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. And then I don't really know you, but sure, maybe you remember me. And I didn't like seek her out or anything. But one day I'm on Facebook minding my own business, and she starts like texting me, instant messaging me stuff like, hey, how's it going? What are you doing? And I was like, ooh, this is weird. And I had a brief conversation with her where, she said, she was deployed overseas and this and that. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is going to turn into one of those scams, right? Where, oh, I'm trying to get home to see my family or see you, but I can't because I'm stuck at the airport. Can you wire me $2,000? It's got to be cash. Yeah. So, no, unfriend. Yeah. Anyway, other stuff like influencing public opinion. You guys may have heard, it was a few years ago, that I don't think it was Lady Gaga in particular, but it was her people, whether it was at her direction or not. But the story was that Lady Gaga had just put out some new video, and she was kind of pissed that a comparable Katy Perry video that was getting more views on YouTube. So they resorted to some measures to inflate the view count. And yeah, it was hard to believe, but yeah, that's what they did. So yeah, influencing public opinion, like, because she really had to be the most popular, whatever. Or finally, gathering information about other users, right? So one of the things you can do with a fake persona, you can gather information about people just for like social engineering attacks. You can say, oh, I'm friends with you, so I can see your wife's name, your kid's name, your dog's name, their birthdays. I can see all this stuff. And maybe if I have access to some of your accounts, I can bundle that up and sell it. Or, they can just gather a lot of that data, bundle it up, sell it on the dark web, so that if somebody says, oh, I know that guy's email, now I know his, his kid's birthdays, so maybe I can hack his account with that. Anyway, excuse me. So symptoms of spam account. Number one, little to no personal information, no posts, no photos. And if somebody sends you a friend request on Facebook, there's a window where you can go in and actually look at their profile. But a lot of these fake accounts, they just leave everything public because they want people to be able to, find them, right? Because, yeah. Anyway, but they don't put up anything. So you get this, account of, some pretty young woman, and she's got like 6 friends and 2 pictures and no posts, and she's had the account for 10 years. And you're like, yeah. Anyway, negligible interactions with friends, quite often a single dominant activity type, right? So the account might just be set up, all I do is do instant messages trying to scam people, right? Or all I do is do thumbs up on some corporate Facebook page. And finally, bursts of friend requests. So spam accounts, if they're the kind that are, trying to meet people in order to scam them somehow, they'll typically send out a big batch of requests when the account is first made live, right? Whereas a normal person would go onto Facebook, say, oh, I know so-and-so and so-and-so. I'll send them some friend requests. And a lot of those requests are going to get accepted, right? Because you actually are friends. With a spam account, not only do you have to send out a whole lot of friend requests, but the positive response rate is going to be really low. Most people are going to say, I don't know you. Why are you trying to friend me? No way. So they act differently. Now, how are spam accounts, how are they detected? How do they survive? Well, it's a lot like your mailbox spam detection. Basically, Facebook builds a profile of some reasonable model of what normal behavior should look like, right? Add a few friends at a reasonable pace, periodically interact with Facebook in different ways, right? Make a few posts, upload a few pictures, stuff like that. If there is a deviation that's very severe from that profile, then yeah, Facebook might flag it as spam. Or users could do that too. Users could say, I don't know this person, they're sending me a friend request, seems sketchy, I think you should look into it. Now, of course, with Facebook doing this, there's inevitably going to be some false positives and some false negatives, right? Sometimes Facebook is going to get it wrong because there can be people who legit behave weirdly. They don't act like normal users on Facebook for whatever reason. Or if you, make it too easy, if you make the threshold too wide, then you're going to get some false negatives. You're going to say that, oh, well, even though this account is a spam account, I'm not going to kick it off of Facebook. So the way these accounts survive, number one, they operate at small scale. If they're only sending out a few friend requests and they're not really doing much damage, yeah, Facebook's going to mostly ignore them. The bad guys may also recycle accounts. So for example, if one account gets shut down, what do? They get a new email, they use the same profile picture, the same other stuff, and they just create a same account with a new email. And the more sophisticated ones actually try to, mimic actual user behaviors. There might even be like an actual human personally managing like a few dozen of these accounts in order to try to scam various people. But the arms race never ends. So if Facebook tries to put up, higher barriers, of course, the bad guys are going to try to do more. Now you got this Chat GPT application for trying to do conversations and stuff. I'm sure the bad guys are working out how to effectively use that on social media. So yeah, the arms race continues. Now, last slide for the day. Remember, okay, so this is a quote. I forget where it's from. I could probably look it up, but it doesn't matter. It says there are two kinds of businesses, ones that have been hacked and ones that don't know it. This goes to my point. Perfect security is impossible. To some extent, every business is slightly compromised. Every business has had some people see some stuff that they shouldn't have gotten or aggregated data in some way that wasn't intended. So perfect security is impossible. So managers have to balance usability against security, right? Because the more hoops you make users jump through, they're going to try to find ways to evade it or otherwise, just not do it. So, and there's going to be system expenses too, right? There's going to be hardware and software and electrical bills and design costs and verification costs, all that. So you look at the costs of it actually of implementing security, combine that with the probable costs of security failures, and you try to minimize that sum, right? Because there's no upper limit really to what you can spend on security. You could spend way more than it's worth. Likewise, if you spend nothing on security, well, you're probably going to lose everything. You got to kind of be in that middle part. Now, brief discussion of how real users might respond to these conditions. So suppose you work for a firm that has decided to improve its security radically, okay? And you are a loyal employee and plan to follow the letter of these new security rules, okay? So first day, the firm says all employees must update their password every day, okay? That's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of cognitive load trying to keep that in your head. What might people do with that sort of situation? What are some ways that people could actually update their password every day, but make life easier for themselves? Because that's a lot to remember. What might they do? What's that? Sure. Okay, so number one, simpler, easier to remember passwords, right? But less secure. What else? Yeah.
Make a note of one every day.
Sure. Write them down. Right? If you write them down, that's a big security risk. What else? Yeah, use similar passwords, right? Like PW123, then PW124, etc. The last thing they might do is use a simple reversible password for even and odd days, right? If it's an even day, you use the password forward. On the odd day, you switch it back to the reverse, and you keep doing that. Okay, so stuff like that. Now, second, the firm says passwords cannot be related to prior passwords. So at that point, right, employees might forget them, lose system time, right, because they got to call up and get their password corrected and all that. What else? They might write them down. Again, bad stuff they might do. What else? Stop using the system and download massive data batches to work remotely, right? They might say, you know what, it's too much of a hassle resetting my password every day. I'm just going to download all the data I'm going to need for the week or for the month and work with that on some other potentially non-secure location. Or last, system admins might even design a backdoor into the system, right? Something like username and admin. Or they might say, you know what, for you, I don't even care what you enter in as your password. You enter in something that kind of looks like your password, or, you know, whatever, we'll let you in, right? So they might do something because it says, it's just too much of a hassle to deal with this password change. So the point of this is that just because you add in a lot more security features doesn't necessarily mean you're going to make systems more secure. Because once again, people are not robots. If the security requirements are too strict and kind of too pointless, a lot of times people are going to find workarounds for it. Okay? Can actually lose security from that. Okay, good. We'll come back on Wednesday. We'll start talking about all these security topics, and we'll try to get done early for Q&A time. See you then.
Excuse me.
Sure.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Actually, two things. Do you prefer informal or formal when students addressing you?
You call me Doug. That's fine. We're all people.
So